the second statement is that successful ILM is dependent on strong stakeholder coordination and management and the combination of skill sets, including negotiation, convening, and facilitation. So what we were really thinking of here is that in some respects, there has to be a shift in focus away from more contemporary skill sets to some of these kinds here when it comes to effective ILM implementation. Panelists, would any of you like to react to this one? Emily agrees, has nothing further to say. Anybody from, okay, we've got raised hands. Do you know who? Delia, please.
Yes, this is completely true. However, the next problem is who is going to do this? You know, George talked about boundary organizations, and boundary organizations are also rare to find. You know, and in many of these cases nowadays, the boundary organizations are being taken by NGOs who doesn't have any permanence also in a given landscape. So this is, you know, nobody I think disagrees with this, but the problem is the who is going to do this. Who is the convener? Who is the negotiator and facilitator for integrated landscape management? And that's, I mean, it goes back to Peter's point about governments. You know, and I reading the chat, there's a lot of comments about governments being so laid back, not changing, you know, so static in their approaches. So what do we do from the research side? So we can only demonstrate through a project, but sustainability remains a question.
Thank you, Delia. Cora?
Yeah, I think I don't agree with the statement. Stakeholder coordination and management implies that it's led by an external actor who comes in to coordinate and manage. If you would replace it by stakeholder collaboration and governance, then I may agree, because that is much more showing that actors themselves are in the driver's seat. And I think that's a must. That's absolute beginning. So conveners, I always have difficulties with the word convener, because who is the one that jumps in and convenes? Is it a project? Is it a researcher? Is it a foreign company? I have very much difficulties with that. I think it's only the people on the ground that make the change, and supporting, allowing them to scale their efforts and break through all these glass ceilings and get involved in political decision making. That's the way to change landscapes, I believe.
No, Cora was really spot on. The first point that she made is really excellent. It's about, I will add another point to it. What is missing in this statement is ownership. If they don't own the process, forget it. Because coordination and management doesn't imply ownership of that, right? I mean, and I think two more things to add to that. I think the stakeholders need to be able to be involved in the action rather than just the negotiation, convening, and facilitation. They need to be involved in owning it, the action, and most importantly, investing in the process. Because what a lot of what we've presupposed in the projects that we are doing is that we are working with external investment. And that's too short a stay. If we can't make the business case for that investment to come from the local system, it won't work.
Multifunctional landscapes project, which we've mentioned a couple of times today. We are at that stage right now where each of the working groups, they develop their own development strategy. We did a fundraising workshop with them. We're working on developing the business case and the fundraising strategy. And I feel like we as a boundary organization could use much more capacity building. We've known from the beginning of the project that in order for these working groups to survive, that we would need to go through this operationalization. And the question is open. You know, they've served their purpose for the project. Do you want to institutionalize this? How do we do that? How do we get it into the government budget cycles? The assemblies are there at our meetings. The planning officers are there. We've talked to the budget officers. And we really don't have the training to do it. So we need to work with their expertise about how to move towards the next step of institutionalization. And not every piece of that platform will be institutionalized. Some pieces they found valuable, some pieces they don't want to continue. So, I mean, I think to this point, there have to be resources. We have to know how to harvest those resources. And as boundary organization, we don't necessarily have that skill set. Some of that skill set exists within those stakeholder groups themselves, but they also don't have the time. So one thing that our project does provide is the time to come together and just do the meetings. We're not even always there. So they've taken a lot of ownership over it, but how do you keep it alive? And it's a challenge.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah, I think Emily's response just covered a little bit of what I was going to say, which kind of brings us back to Earth. That back to reality, if local collaboration was going to solve the problem, they'd be solving all the problems. So there is obviously a need for some kind of facilitation, and that is because communities are already being intervened in hundreds of ways by governments, by projects, and being told what to do. So there has to be a facilitating space to make something else possible. And that's something that an external facilitator like us could provide, or a local academic institution, a local research institution that is in the landscape, but perhaps without the kind of stake that George was saying that the facilitator shouldn't have. The other thing I wanted to say is I think I disagree a bit with Cora on the point she made earlier about not corresponding with jurisdictions. Because my understanding of the history of integrated landscape and development conservation, ICDPs, whatever they are, was that one of the big failings was precisely they were not corresponding with any kind of government jurisdiction, which meant nothing ever got institutionalized anywhere. We still have massive challenges to make that happen. And one of the challenges that we've found from different research projects where we've asked this question is that if the government entity doesn't have, if a desk at government, my terms of reference doesn't include in my responsibilities communicating and networking with that office over there, I won't do it. I don't have an incentive to do it, and sometimes I have a strong disincentive because if I do things that aren't in my TOR, I can get in trouble. So there's a whole other piece here to helping simple changes, I think, in government like that, I think could be quite significant.
Thanks. We'll come to you just now, James.
Just a very simple point. I don't see anything in the statement about being externally driven, and of course, ideally, but it would be someone among the stakeholders who would be driving these things. But you need a champion. You need someone to bring people together. I can't see practically how it would work unless someone is bringing people together. And the ideal is for that to come from within, but and initially it may come from to identify a champion or a convener and a handover.
Great, thank you. James, did you have a comment?
I can. I think most of what I was going to say was already addressed by both Emily and Anne. But I think, I generally agree with the statement. But I think this idea that we need to leave communities to themselves to resolve, I don't really agree with that, because I think, there's both a lack of capacity, there's a lack of rights there, but also as these communities are increasingly confronted with external forces and globalization and large private sector organizations, then the capacity there just isn't there. So I think they do need the external support or some kind of structure in place that enables the integrated landscape approach to continue. Because certainly what our experience has shown in Zambia is that they've had a whole history of projects coming and going, and there's a huge fanfare when the project arrives, and then everyone just disappears and there's nothing said at the end of the project. So I think this is a really important challenge, and I think it's naive to think that communities can just manage these challenges themselves.
Thank you. Mina, did you have? Oh, Mika, sorry. No. Mina, online?
Are you calling me?
Yes, I think
Yeah,
so.
okay.
I don't know.
Sorry, I didn't quite recognize the pronunciation of my name. And I think the one thing that we haven't heard at all this afternoon is the role of forest and forestry organizations. And I think Cora correctly mentioned that the typical part of landscape approaches is being able to give the vertical connection. And the case we started 20 years ago in Sumberjaya was we could resolve a lot of conflicts by basically challenging some of the basic concepts that exist within Ministry of Forestry about what forest is and does with respect to water, and challenging the biophysical concepts behind their stuff, opened the space for institutional change. And yes, when we asked practitioners of landscape approaches in Indonesia a couple of years ago what the constraints are, it turned out about half are solvable within landscapes, and the other half comes from above. Yeah, so specifically when we look at CIFOR-ICRAF, our role is as much to consolidate in the education of foresters and forestry people, the next generation, that the concept of forest has to change and has to be multifunctional and has to be linked in with all this and that. Unless we do that, we go back to the same problem every next generation, with every new batch of foresters coming and not having been trained in handling these things. So I think there is a lot of role specifically for CIFOR-ICRAF to take this thing into a longer term vision beyond the specific landscape level continuity that we talk about. Thanks.
Thank you, Mina. George.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate what Cora is saying, but I do have to completely agree with James and some of the things that Anne is also bringing up. Is that, okay, it's one thing about having people brought together, but there are some very practical things that need to happen if you want to do this right and have long-term solutions. And this institutionalization issue is key. And it requires a lot of skills and a lot of support to engage and navigate the complex bureaucracy for those purposes. And not to mention, it requires a lot of resources to bring government stakeholders around the table. I mean, we've been seeing doing these multi-stakeholder processes is that if you don't pay those per diems, there's nobody there. They'll send you an intern. And it's the same thing with thinking about, okay, communities need better services, but there is absolutely zero capacity to effectively engage the private sector. So I think bridging organizations are key. Bridging organizations need to come in very, very early to also build the skill sets that communities that have perhaps self-organized needs to engage those stakeholders effectively. Because if you don't, I think there are all sorts of capture risks and ultimately failure problems.
Okay, great. Thanks, George. Cora?
Yes, yeah, sorry, I'm too busy thinking so many nice things which are being said. I want to react to Mena. Mena, yeah, I've learned so much from you. So this is one of these things. The roles of forests have changed. So our understanding needs to be changed. And the change comes from education. That's where the professionals learn their conceptualizations. I think exactly the same is now needed for landscapes. Now that we professionals think we understand how landscapes work, we also think that there is a need for new framing. And again, that starts from education. So this whole restoration and this landscape thinking, there is not a single curriculum in this world that provides professionals with the skill sets that they need to manage and initiate these processes on the ground. That's actually, I want to do a bit of promotion here. We're just starting a new program on restoration education together with Wageningen and NGLF. And we really want to transform education and create these integrated curricula for a new flock or cohort of professionals that have these complementary skill sets that are able to think intersectorally, interdisciplinary, and inter-stakeholder. How do I say that? Multi-stakeholder. We really need CIFOR, we need you scientists for this ICRAF. Please join in and let's make this big because it's bitterly needed.
Thanks very much. Delia.
No, thanks, Kim. I think I have nothing more to add. I think that everything has been said well. The capacity building, as I mentioned, the first challenge in the Asia Pacific LFA projects is the lack or limited experience and knowledge about ILM. So that really connects to the need for professionals trained in ILM, which is a major problem with the way our educational system is, working because of the training on specialization in forestry, in agriculture, in water, etc. So I think that Cora's intervention is it has been long overdue, in fact, Cora, right? The training, the capacity building of new professionals, and also Mina's point about the going back to the professionals that need to work on landscapes. Thanks.
Okay, that's great. All right, and then a final comment from James Reed, and then I think we have to close the session. We've already run a little bit over time. James.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, just building on what George was saying about these kind of boundary organisations, I think potentially as well there's a need for some sort of watchdog for integrated landscape projects. I mean, there is such a proliferation now, and even this statement saying successful ILM, who defines what success is? And I think there's the danger that these landscape approaches are being co-opted now by private sector organisations, or even the jurisdictional approaches. And I think we need to have some kind of watchdog that is assessing and providing that critical lens of what's happening to the local communities and the people on the ground that aren't able to access these processes. So that was all I really wanted to say.
Those are excellent concluding comments. So thank you very much to you all, in particular the presenters to this session, all 5 of you, and then to your participation both here and globally. Thank you so much. That's the end of the session. Wishing you a good night and good evening. Thank you.